Now, this is an extremely interesting thing that was started in GeneXus 15, and let me tell you what it's all about. And this is what caused some confusion. We've already seen that on the basis of version 15, all transactions have a data provider, and we can see what happens when we write in 2, and it's an associated data provider. And we have seen how it is used to populate the physical tables that are created. Now we're going to concentrate on this new value, which is a second possible value, which is retrieve data. We're going to use the data provider to retrieve data. When GeneXus comes across this configuration for a transaction, that is, the transaction has a data provider associated to recover data, to retrieve data, it understands it's a dynamic transaction. This means that it's not going to create physical table in the database for that transaction, but it's going to create a list on the database. So we have to indicate in the data provider what information we would like to load in the attributes of that dynamic transaction. That is, once we run this dynamic transaction, there is no physical table, so what is it that we want to retrieve from the attributes to be shown? We can also use those attributes usually, as it always happens with GeneXus, on listings, web, everything, just the same. So we're going to see how to define that data provider. Also, a dynamic transaction may be referenced as a transaction. We're going to see this in the examples. Now, this first case of use proposes joining data, a data union. Let's suppose in our knowledge base, this sales management of show tickets, we have a sales transaction and credit. They're not dynamic, they're just the same. They have a physical table, and each sale has an identifier, a sales date. It's sold for one show, for one sector, one place, price, currency. And here it says sales amount, which is a true attribute to sale because you want to store it and you want to know the price at which it was sold and, you know, the sector of the show. So there is a rule in this transaction allocating the price sector here because we wanted to store it. Now, whenever there is a return of a ticket, then you have to write out a bill of credit. So there you have an identifier, a date, and you simply indicate the ID of the sale. So all the data is brought in, and let's suppose it's on the ticket, it's printed, and so you are returning it. Now, we have to have all this data together. This is the movement. This is a movement concept, and we want to have all that together. To that end, you need, you want to print them ordered by date. A possible solution, which is wonderful in relation to how we would solve it earlier, was to define a transaction which I called movement. We can see it's dynamic because it has an associated data provider to recover data. So GeneXus understands that it needn't create a physical table for this transaction. Just see that I have put in a composed transaction. And here I have the possibility of repeating names. I put a composed character and I put an S or a C, meaning credit, in order to put in the same number for sale or credit bill. I define these attributes, date, currency, and so on. And since this isn't a physical table, it's a consultation, I would like to recover it, and I would simply define it as an attribute. Now, GeneXus creates this data provider simply because I turned on this data provider here, and the source is initialized, the structure of the transaction. And I would complete it in this way. This is my intention. My intention is to surf all along the sales. I complete it here from sales. and load them as movements. That is, for each sale, I'm loading an S here, sales ID, date, amount, and the name of the currency. That's what I want to retrieve. From all the credit bills, I am loading them, uploading them as a C, and all the information as well. And so I've already defined what my concept of movement is. Once I've defined this, I can execute the transaction and I can see what all the movements are like, and I can use the pattern for SD, I can define all the objects I need, and I can also even put this as a foreign key for another transaction. So there is there's a list of selection and so on. If I'm working with smart devices and I can I put this as fly, and what would happen in that case? Let's see, Gustavo, if you can help me out here. Hello. In the smart device, what you've got is a table. You've got tables which have copied data from the server. And the difference in this case can be made. Now, there's going to be a table in the device with the data that you used to have when the sync was made, but from the server side, it's just view. There's no physical table. In the device, you had a physical table. Now, what happens is that all tables in the device are temporal. They're just to work in the device, but the data, the real data, would be stored in the server, and the sync is made there. So that table, you won't be able to insert and record anything, and Maya will tell you why. You can't do it directly in that dynamic transaction. But if you do something that we can do to insert registers, that would have a repercussion on the real tables, which in this case is sales and movement. So in fact, this is orthogonal, and in your smart device, you'll be able to use it as one further table, one further transaction. But from the server standpoint, when it's synchronized, when it's synced, then the data would have stored under sale in this case, or in credit notes. Well, in the smart device, it would seem that you could use it. But the real data are in the on the server side, and there is no table for movements. It's just for sale, and yeah. There's another question here. Something I want to say here. Now, in the offline, then you have synchronized it, and then after that you add a sale. That's not going to be on the movement table until you synchronize it again, right? That doesn't happen with a web, because automatically you have it in the movements, and here you don't until you sync. You have dragged it, but it's a bit delayed. Properties. Have you got a third one? Yes, we're going to see it. Well, that's my question. We're going to see it in a minute. If the view is updated, yes, we're going to see that, yes. Very well. So once you've defined the dynamic transaction and the way of uploading it, what's in my definition of movement? Let's suppose that the company asks me to make a list, a daily list of movements, the daily movements. And I would simply work naturally with, for each movement, it's going down instead of up. But I wanted to have first the sales and then the credits. I would like to see the sales first. And so I had to order them in a descending order and then by date. So this is the exit, and I got it on this date, and on this date I can see that there were 3 sales for this amounts and in these currencies, and then credit bill under this number for this amount. If I had wanted to retrieve more information or show something else, then I would define that as an attribute for view. Is it more efficient? The question is whether it's more efficient than generating a data provider. Well, yes, that case it depends on a case-by-case basis whether it's more efficient if you do it by hand. In this case, it's more efficient because it's just one single question, SQL. Everything is solved in the server, and you get the union of data between sales and credits. If you did it with a data provider, as we used to do, you would have to serve twice, one for credit bills and the other one for sales. So you would go twice to the server. In this case, you're only going just one with one single sentence. Is the view updated? Now, the view is as if it was a stored query in the DMS. So what you're improving is that you go make a round trip once to the SQL with a query with another name. They are renamed, but at the end of the day, from the DMS standpoint, it can solve it. It knows it's a union. It knows that it has to look for data in the two tables, and it would bring them down in one single query. The question is, if when I go up to the database, if I do it manually, select view, well, yes, you always see the data. Whenever you make a select on the database, on the list, it's as if you were doing the data then. Those are the ones that are valid. Now the view, he's asking if you have two concurrent users making select on that view. Well, it's just the same as if two people at the same time are clicking on a table. In the same way, I've defined this list, this procedure. I can also use the pattern for each for when, or one for smart devices. I could define a web panel, whatever. Now, let's look at a second case of use case. We have to model a reality in this case. So let's suppose that the company is making promotions in this way. It gives you 50% off for shows that will be presented within 5 days and that are available. Certain sectors have same or more than 100 seats available. And in that case, they're going to be sold with a 50% discount. Now, an interesting alternative to have available and see what the specific promotions are is to define a dynamic transaction. Let me show you this definition. For instance, I like to define it in this way, and let me explain it to you, why I've defined it in this way. Now, we all agree that what I needed to retrieve was sectors in the show that fulfill certain conditions, right? So I defined the promotions, and as a primary key, I identified that here I would identify each promotion as unique, the show and the sector, right? That can't be repeated. It's a promotion. Why didn't I put in the same name? Well, because dynamic transactions can have parallel transactions. I mean, that's logical because since it's a view on the database, it has to have one single definition. So what I did was to write in different names. I would identify the single identifier, and I would put in the names and attributes I want, because this is going to be a query, as I said. So here, what I'm saying is that I'm going to the sectors in the shows with a certain number of available seats, the same or bigger than 100, and I'm asking about the date and then I would take the dates in the server, the same, equal, or less than 5, and that this deduction is not given any negative numbers. I'm using here server date because in this data provider, where the dynamic association is made, since it's stored in the server, I can't use variables, no variables, and no other functions from the client. So here I'm defining my concept of promotion, and I'm loading those sectors, full sectors with key, and when GeneXus finds this dynamic transaction with another name, and I'm allocating a name here, it understands that this is the sector, and I'll be able to infer the base table, and I'll define a sector. So what I'm doing here is loading the sectors that are available in within 5 days, and I retrieve the full key, the name of the show, the date. I'm taking advantage of given the present promotion price, the currency, and the place where it's going to take place, the venue. So I can define a web panel. As you can see, well, I've ordered it as I wanted, for a user. Let's see it when you run it. But all this is promotion, except here, sector name. So I took advantage, as I said, that GeneXus knows that this is the key, that this is the information. It knows it's a sector in the show, and then the attributes of the table base, and the attributes can be used directly. That's the only one I took advantage of. I could have used sector price, but I've already used price in the promotion. And then here we can see that this is the promotion for these shows. This is the only one for the future because I had already done it. I did it some days ago. So very well, let's see a third use case to solve statistics. Let's suppose that for a certain period, for a given period, you want to know the number of sales per day. Now, this company is interested, every sale has a date, and it's for one single ticket, for one entrance to a sector in the show. So they are interested in knowing the number of sales per day. And they want it for a range. They want to know per day how many tickets were sold, or for a certain date how many sales were made, and which was the best day of the year in terms of the number of sales, to analyze that data. So one further alternative would be to define a dynamic transaction. I called it the statistics in this case, and I said as a key is going to be date, statistics date, and a statistics sales quantity. That's all. It's dynamic because it's to retrieve data with the data provider. And what I'm doing here is I'm saying, okay, this is from, I'm surfing the sales, and with a unique clause I'm saying that I'm taking the sales for a certain date only once. And I take up that date, I allocate it as a date, and then I can count the total number. I could have put any sale attribute, sale date, sale amount, I don't know. And so I'm surfing here, and I'm taking the data just once, and for that date, I'm counting the number of sales. Now, once I've defined this, I can solve the requests I've been made. For instance, for each statistics, putting in the base transaction, filtering by range and date, and just showing the date and quantity. The same thing for today, for instance. And then when I was asked what the best day of the year was, I'm also doing a for each base transaction statistics. I'm doing it in a descending pattern by quantity, and what I'm filtering is that the year is the same as we have now. I take the first register, exit, and print. Or I could also write out a formula which has a date, and what I'm trying to find is a statistics, provided the year coincides with this year, and I maximize it by quantity and I return the date. Now, when you defined the dynamic transaction a little bit earlier, and when you said count and you said you could put any other attribute like sales amount, for instance, in SQL, for instance, if that attribute had zero value, it wouldn't count it. GeneXus would count it. It's important to know whether it supports, this attribute supports nil in the number of results. Gustavo can answer that. Hello. Well, it depends on the DMS, whether it's going to count it or not. And I can't remember very well what DMS do one thing and what other DMS does. What you're saying is right, but some are counting it as valid and others don't. You would have it independent of this if you were programming with GeneXus, not with a dynamic transaction, and you do count. The problem is the same. We haven't changed that, really. It's the same as we've always been. That changes a little bit from one DMS to the other one, but I can't tell you which one counts them and which ones don't. To solve that problem, in SQL Server, you put in an asterisk and it counts the line independent of the values and the fields. I don't know if you'll be able to use it or put an asterisk or Yes, that's right. I can't remember by heart all this, but we also put a count asterisk, but there are some DMS, we support many DMS. Some, as our colleague said, it's true. Some count and some don't, but we do this asterisk, and I can find out. I can't remember very well in which there is a difference, but it's not because of a dynamic transaction. It's because of the idiosyncrasy of DMS. They're not all the same, and some of them may have a certain peculiarity, but we do this count asterisk, yes.
In
the previous example, when you showed the promotions, you said that it was not possible to use variables, and therefore, if you have 100 free tickets for 5 days, for example, if I wanted this to be customizable in the application, is there any way of invoking something from the data provider so that it will return the parameters that are stored somewhere with regard to the seats that are available and the days in which I want to offer them? It can be done. It's a feature that is more advanced. It's called transactions that can be parametered, and you will soon find it in the wiki. It's more complicated, so I didn't want to enter into details, but it can be done. Now, do not make a mistake. It's in data provider. It's in this data provider that there is an association to the transaction so that it is dynamic. Here you can put functions that can be solved in the server, but in the other reports and everything that is GeneXus, you can use variables in the web panels, etc. Yes, you can. Whether it can emit parameters? Well, this is the definition of promotion. This is a dynamic transaction it is defining. And you can define a transaction that can be parametered. let's say that from a web panel, I'm going to need someone to enter a range of dates, and those dates have to be brought to this data provider so that they are used in the code. And in this case, I will going to put here attributes as part of the key that are going to be part of the key, and I also have to put them through Parm in order to use them, and that's how it's solved. So let's go to the next case. I still have a question about your previous example. The definition of a max here, is it more performant than the one on the top? Well, it depends on what you want to do. We always recommend the formulas. What does Gustavo think? Which one gives the best performance? In this case in particular, well, it will always depend on the DMS and how complex was the data provider. But in the case you showed, it was very simple, so I don't think you will see any difference in performance, because in both cases the solution is more or less the same. If you look at the SQL code that will be generated, it's more or less the same. But in the case of a dynamic transaction, part of this sentence is in view and it's stored as a view in the DMS. But anyway, it has to be calculated when you use it. You're not going to win too much. What changes is that the select that you send to the DMS with the dynamic transaction is much shorter, because you're going to name only a couple of fields as if they were tables. But the engine SQL that is behind basically has to solve the same queries. So in this case, you're not going to see much of a difference. Anyway, at the back, you have one field. On the lower part, you would have one field in one case, and in the other case, two. Here we have only the date, and here we have the quantity in a list. So let's go to the fourth case, and we are going to change the example because this is an application that Nicolas Rodal made a few years ago. I'll tell you about it. It was firstly to record the weights of the people at certain dates. Firstly, you have to register the gender, and here we have a log of weights, which has a weight log, a date, and a complex key. So the person would weight herself or himself at a certain date and record the weight. Now, as time went by, this application was further developed and other measurements were considered and not only weights. So this transaction of measures was created, and this transaction was born, which is almost like this one. Here we have the person, the date, and the weight, and here the person, the date, the measurement as part of the key, and the value of the measurement. So we see that measure are to be assigned with an associated data provider like in True, and here I can choose populate data with a physical table, so measure is created as a physical table, and these data are stored. Otherwise, here I see an example of use, which is a dynamic transaction, and I am not recovering attributes. These are fixed values that I want to have, as you see, so that I know that one is weight, two is the measure, the chest measure, etc. So this is the way of populating them and the values. Now, it turns out that weight load was being used in many places as base transaction, and these attributes were being used in many objects. So in order to evolve better, Nicolas, who uses a lot dynamic transactions, thought of defining this transaction as dynamic. And here it says data provider in True, so At that moment, the physical table ceases to exist. So the first thing we have to do is to upload all this information we have to measure load. Assigning the person, the date, here putting 1 because 1 is the weights, and here uploading the kilos as values. Once I have loaded it, I mark it as dynamic. And what's the way of recovering the information so that everything continues to be valid? I say that I want to recover by surfing measure load, provided the measure is weight, and I assign the person, the date, and the value as kilos. So everything is still valid, and I have evolved quickly. So here I just copied the scenario. We have the two transactions that are involved, measure load, and this one that is dynamic. But it turns out that we are told that they want to continue allowing weight load to edit. So the user was already used to entering the weights and the measures, so he can go either way. For this purpose, we have another property under the same group of data properties, data provider, update policy, and by default, the value was read-only, but I changed it to updatable, so these attributes are going to be editable. And where are they going to be saved, this data, because there's no physical table associated to this dynamic transaction? It's something I have to define by defining the events of the transaction in insert, update, and delete, because obviously I'm going to record them here with the concept of business component. Therefore, in insert, we see that we have defined a variable business component of measure load, and what we are doing is to assign, because I have these attributes, and I assign always putting 1, because if they come in from here, they are weights, and I am assigning the person, the kilos, the date, to the variable business component and its properties. I apply the insert method and I extract the messages. Here, in the case of the update, I put load, so here I have a key, and I do load in the business component, putting the whole key and 1 to complete it. And then I change the kilos for the measure and I update. And in delete, I load and delete. With regard to the delete method, what I have to tell you is that it has not changed because it's a method that already exists and not like the insert or the update. And it has not changed. Collections does not apply. It is necessary to load. And this is so that the errors come up in the error viewer. What about production? What you needed there was to create a new field that is part of the primary key. In the past, we used to reorganize into steps, which made the evolution easier. And the production was also in 2 steps, but here the production is firstly to turn it to the view, and we have here 2 steps in the production too. I haven't analyzed that. Yes, you always need production and prototype, it's the same thing. In the update, yes, I could have done it. I could have done new and assign it as I had said. Yes. These events update the view of the weight log. What this is doing is that I am using this transaction, which is dynamic, allowing to edit. So since I am editing and I'm physically recording in measure load. Here, every time there is a consultation, there is an update. And it is executed. If the dynamic transaction makes reference to several transactions, you just name them among the events in order to have updates in many places. Could you do that? Say again, please, if the dynamic transaction refers to the attributes of several transactions, can you update them? Well, you have to define the variables, business components of each one of them. So, to sum up, let me tell you about the advantages of defining dynamic transactions. They allow to describe realities and intentions flexibly. In the case of promotions, the concept of promotion exists in that company. It's what we've always said. It's an object of reality. It's a concept that exists, so I can model it. And in this way, I was able to describe it, and without having to store it, it's already defined. And this will be much easier than to define locally and bringing into each web panel, in each object, even if I have a data selector for the conditions. Well, now what I have is something defined with the power of defining a transaction, and thus I can use it in all the ways we know. So simplify development so as not to use USDTs or other alternatives that are more time-consuming. And as we saw, it allows for an easier evolution. The system evolves more easily, and it's easier for new developers, because when we show this concept to new developers, well, they learn everything together and start applying it and think of new uses.